Hello, everyone, and welcome to Let's Talk About Equity, a diversity, equity, inclusion microlearning module. My name is Emily Holthouse, and I am the Managing Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Nonprofit HR. We are incredibly excited to partner with NHPCO to bring this module to all of you today. The diverse voices of our provider community inspire us to grow and bring change for the benefit of all. This includes taking a positive stand for more inclusion and equity for all, through a commitment to go further and challenge our boundaries as well as help others along their journey. As an organization dedicated to person and family-centered care, we are using our talent and resources as well as that of our members to be the voice of change. We know that as the leading organization in hospice and community-based palliative care, NHPCO must be intentional in acting on these issues and provide resources to affect change across the provider community and the communities of patients and families served. We're excited to be a partner in this effort. This is one such way that education for equity and inclusion will be a part of what NHPCO brings to all of you in the network. So let's jump in. Let's get started. Today we're going to talk about 4 different things, and this module today will be interactive. We'll pause, we'll stop. It will probably take about an hour for you to go through with us, knowing that we're going to set the stage with a common language, talk about the connection between systems thinking and equity, talk about this point in time and why it is an important time in our country and in our world to be thinking about and centering equity. And then finally, we'll talk about you as leaders in the organization and what you might need to do differently to become an equity leader in your role in your organization. So for those of you that are doing this work in a small group today, we just wanted to share these engagement principles with you. We're going to give you time to stop and talk with each other. We want to make sure that we're going to be present with each other, respect confidentiality. Anything that is shared or said stays here, but the learning leaves with us. We're going to assume positive intent from our colleagues, speak for you and speak your truth. This isn't a time for judgment or debating. We're really going to just listen and learn and expand our perspective together during the conversation. It'll be important when we pause to make room for all voices and let everyone who would like to contribute to the conversation get a chance to do so. And then finally, at the end of this hour, you may leave with more questions than you have answers, but it's important for us to see this as the start of an important conversation. The other thing I'd like to note is whenever you see that little symbol below in purple, that will be your indicator to listen to the instructions for the activity and then pause the video and do the activity. And if you're looking at this on your own and you're not in a group, you can still take a minute to reflect and pause on the question and then restart the video to get ready for the next pieces in the exercise. So here we go. Let's jump in. We're going to start out setting the stage with just making sure that we all are clear around what we're talking about related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity often, especially here in the United States, we talk about things like age or race as the places we go first, gender sometimes when we're having this discussion. But really, diversity is so much more than that. It's the idea that when we all come into places and spaces together, what differing dimensions do we bring that create the differences between us? And so in this case, in this example, this is a diverse group of shoes because they are all different colors. They bring different colors to the space and place. They're also different types and styles of shoes. But at the same time, this group of shoes is a homogeneous group of shoes because they're all left shoes. So it's not about the shoe itself. It's about what the shoe brings to a space and place that may be differing than what other shoes bring to the space and place. And the same works for us as humans as we come into environments together. So let's unpack this just a little bit. Diversity is all about many different dimensions. And as you see there in the center, those core dimensions, those are things like gender, age, race, physical, mental ability. Those are considered core to us. They're oftentimes things that we cannot change about ourselves. Maybe they might be more visible, maybe not in some cases. As you move out into the orange, those are dimensions that are also core, but typically less visible. For instance, you would have to have a conversation with me potentially if you wanted to understand my religious traditions or fully know my social class and economic standing. That's not something that if you passed me on the street, you would necessarily know about me. And then as we move out into the green, those are all really important dimensions. We call them secondary though, because they fluctuate throughout our lifetime based on what is happening in our lives, where we are in the evolution of things that are happening. But they are equally important and shape how we show up in spaces and places in the workplace. I think all of you can think back and reflect. I know for me, family status is a big one. I was a very different person in the workplace before I got married and before I had children, right? And it really has shaped and changed how I prioritize things, how I make decisions, how I empathize. I think all of us would also recognize, one phone call on health status can completely change our perspective about what we prioritize and how we show up in spaces and places with others. So all of the dimensions across this are incredibly important. So I am going to ask you all to do an activity with each other now. I want you to think about these dimensions and choose one that jumps out to you today as important. Any of them on the screen. You can pick whatever you like. And then with that dimension, I want you to, in your group, self-identify with the group with that dimension. So if I picked family status or role today, I would say, I'm a mom of 2 boys and a wife. That might be how I identify. So take a minute to think about what jumps out for you, and I'm going to let you press pause and share with your colleagues, and then restart when you're ready. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to learn and see some of the dimensions of diversity in the place and space that you're in. And I asked you to do it for a couple of reasons. One is just so that you could begin to see and learn what some dimensions of your colleagues bring to the table. But also it's important to note that it is the individual's role to self-identify. And we as humans sometimes will, in the first 10 seconds of meeting someone, try to put them in as many of these boxes as we can. But really the responsibility lies on the individual to let us know how they interact and they identify in these spaces. So as much as we can, we want to have these conversations with our colleagues to begin to know what dimensions they bring to the table and how that shapes their leadership and how that shapes how they're showing up in the work environment with all of us. So diversity is all of those things we bring to the table, and the inclusion part of it is, now what do we do with that? And it's that idea that we leverage, welcome, make sure everyone can bring their whole authentic self to a space or place, and we make them feel valued and welcome in that space. And so it's important to note that there's things that we can do to increase inclusion and make people feel valued and welcomed, and there's things that we can do to decrease inclusion in environments. And it's an intentional act we need to take to do that. One of the questions I would put out to all of you is, when you think about who you trust most and who you pull closest to you in the workplace, we as humans tend to default to doing that with those that share some of those dimensions of diversity that I talked about in the wheel before. It's an intentional act to say, I'm going to push outside of that and what I'm most comfortable with, and begin to get to know others and begin to fully include and pull them close and leverage and value them in the workplace. It's an important intentional act that we all need to think about as we create inclusion. And here's why this is important. Inclusion is this piece that if we do it, it can drive something very important in our coworkers and in our environment, and it's that feeling of belonging. So diversity is what it is. We're all going to bring these unique things to the space and place. Inclusion is a choice that I make. I decide whether or not I'm going to include you or not. Belonging is about the feeling that you get when I decide to include you and pull you close and leverage and value your voice and respect the dimensions of diversity that you bring to the table. So the reason why this is important in the workplace, and when we think about how we interact with each other, how you all interact with your families and constituents that you see every day, you want to make sure that as your work is very demanding and difficult, we want people to come to the environment and feel like they can bring their whole selves there. And that quote really sticks with me. We've all in our time had places and spaces where we felt we haven't belonged, and we remember what that feeling is like. Now imagine getting up every day and having that same feeling at work and in the workplace. And I think all of us would agree that that isn't anything that we want for ourselves or for any of our colleagues. So it's important for us to think about how we're cultivating an inclusive environment. Equity is at the foundation of this conversation, and it's this idea that we want to make sure that everyone has what they need in order to be accessible to things or have access to opportunities or to belong in a space or a place. And so I like to start with this idea that we sometimes use the word equality and equity interchangeably, but actually they are two very different concepts. And if you think about equality, equality is that notion that we're going to give everyone equal treatment. Everyone's going to get the same thing. That's the fair way to do it. We don't want to give someone more or less than the other person. Everyone needs equal treatment. And there are definitely times when equality is the right approach to take. If any of you have little kids like I do at snack time, equality is important. Everybody needs to have the exact same amount of snack, right? You don't want to give one child more than the other. Equality is important. There's times where that approach is appropriate and relevant. But there are also times when we have to recognize the unique differences that everyone brings to the table. And if we think back to that wheel, and a lot of those dimensions of diversity in that wheel, we don't have control over them. They aren't things that are a choice for us. And in this example, I don't know about y'all, but I don't have control over my height, right? And if we're looking at the opportunity being access to the apple here, in the first frame, 2 out of the 3 figures cannot access that opportunity based on something they have no control over, which is height. So equity says we recognize that people have different starting points, and then we give them what they need to be successful in that space. So in the second frame, we've got the right level of support to help all of them achieve the goal of having the apple. But I have a question for this though. If we really want people to have access to the apple in this scenario, why aren't the apples already in a basket on the ground? If we really truly wanted people to have them, we would create a system that allows for access for all without anyone needing any accommodations. And at the end of the day, that's what we want to do. When the system isn't working properly, we need to give people the support they need to get access. But ideally, we want to take a look at that system and reimagine it so that it becomes an equitable system where no one needs accommodations. Just to dive in a little further, equity is that guarantee of fair treatment, access, and opportunity for all, where individuals are not at a disadvantage because of their background, race, social position, insert any of those things in the wheel that I just showed you. Equity requires eliminating those systemic, societal, I would say even unwritten norms that have prevented the full participation of certain groups. And then our role is to develop solutions that are relevant. So if we think about this and why this is complex, the idea that systems far outlive those who created them. And in this example that I'm showing you here, this is the practice of redlining. In the early 1900s in the United States, this was a common practice. It was a legal practice. And what it was about was risk in lending is the foundation of it. And what the organizations would do is they would say, if your community was outlined in red, your community was considered a high-risk lending area, in fact, the highest risk lending area. And banks at that point, because of that red line status, would not provide loans to people to start businesses. They would not provide as many home loans because they were considered riskier areas. Fast forward to 2021, and this was a map from 1938. Fast forward to 2021, and you will go into communities that were historically redlined, and you still won't find a grocery store. Kids will still have to get on a bus to go outside of their community to get to school. You will still see low home ownership rates due to the systemic piece that was happening in the early 1900s. Systems far outlive those who created them. So it's important for us to think about, what does that mean for us now? That many of us are living and operating in systems in our organizations that we didn't create, but they may not be working for everyone. That's the challenge for us to figure that out. So I want to know, what other examples of this can you think of? Systems that maybe have been around for a long time that we're still feeling the effects of. And are there any of those systems that you can think of that would be specifically related to the mission that you serve within hospice? So I'm going to ask you to press pause on the video and have a conversation with your colleagues to see how many of these examples you can think of and talk through it a little bit. I'll see you back in a minute. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good discussion. I'm guessing you talked about some of the pieces that in healthcare have been around for a really long time that maybe have been barriers or prevented access from certain groups throughout time. And so the challenge is to think about, what does this mean for you all in hospice? And how can you begin to think about, once we recognize where there might be some inequities creeping into our systems, our programs, our processes, how do we begin to shift and reimagine those systems so that they begin to work for everyone, getting those apples into a basket on the ground so that they're accessible. That's your challenge as you think about how you're going to apply this in your work today. So I want to talk a little bit about what gets in the way and why this conversation is so difficult. And I like to use the analogy that the world is filled with invisible doors, and we walk in and out of these invisible doors every single day. They represent access to things, they represent opportunities that we have. And because those door frames are invisible, at times we just don't even know that they're there. And what's important about us not knowing that they're there is that others who are experiencing that same door and maybe have differing dimensions of diversity than we do, that same door that we just walked through might look like this to them. The door might be locked, it might be closed, the door frame itself might not be even in the purview of that person in front of them, based on the differing dimensions of diversity that we talked about that, again, oftentimes we have no control over. And when we've just walked through that door, we believe that our experience is typical, and we think that, you know, if we were able to walk through it, everybody should be able to walk through it. And we tend not to believe the experience of the person who is telling us that it looks like this to them. We say things like, well, what do you mean it didn't work for you? I just had access to that. My partner over here just had access to that. What are you talking about? Why is it not working? And when the other person tries to explain that it isn't working for them because that door is invisible, we tend not to believe their experience. And so it's important for us to think about that for a moment and say, is our experience really typical? Or is it such that really your experience is unique based on the dimensions of diversity that you bring to the table? And in order for us to understand where some of those invisible door frames might be open for us and closed for others, it really requires for us to get proximity to those who experience the world differently than we do, and then really be open to listening and understanding those differing perspectives. And as we do that, we start to bring some of those invisible door frames to our view. We start to see where they are. We start to see where we have them and other people may not have them. The idea is once we do that and once we start to see those door frames, if I'm able to walk through that door frame, my job is to turn around and make sure that the door is unlocked and open for everyone in my organization or in this space and place where I have that influence. Here's another little thing that gets in the way. It's this thing called implicit bias, and it's part of us as humans, no matter where we are on the planet. Our brains are wired to take shortcuts based on just the sheer amount of information and inputs that comes into our spaces and places every single day. Our brains just can't consciously process everything. Implicit bias is something we could spend 2 hours talking just about this piece, but it's that idea that our brain does have to make those shortcuts by necessity. But when we do take those shortcuts, it decreases the accuracy sometimes of the decisions we make, and it affects our understanding and our actions and our decisions, oftentimes all in a very much unconscious manner. And so the reason why this is important is because all of us as humans have bias. Our brains do this, it makes shortcuts. And how does that impact our decision making when we're creating policies or designing new programs or interacting with others in our environment? And because we are all human, our human bias can potentially be introduced into our organizations, because organizations, if you think about it, are made up of small decisions cumulatively made by humans every single day, right? And so if we as humans have bias, we can introduce bias into our organization. And it's important for us to recognize when that might be happening and then do what we can to interrupt those processes. I want to give you an example of how this potentially showed up in an organization. And I love music, so I like to use this example of the symphony orchestra. If you think back to the 1970s, for those of you that were around at that time, like I was, when you looked at the musicians and the maestros that were in the top 5 orchestras in the United States, almost exclusively, those artists and maestros were men at that time. And the orchestra started to question itself, like, why is it that we only have men in these seats? We know that women love music, we know that women play music, but for whatever reason, they just weren't moving into those roles. So the orchestra decided to solve for that a little bit. We're going to try to figure out what might be happening in our organization, what limiting beliefs we might be having about women and their ability to do this. And we're going to try to solve for that in our organization. And when they did that, what they realized is that it probably started at the very beginning, at the audition process. And so they decided, we think that there's some inequities in this process, we're gonna reimagine it. So what they decided to do was say all of the people who were evaluating artists were gonna sit out in the audience. They put a big black curtain across the stage. They asked all artists to remove their shoes, because think about it, if I'm wearing some heels or something and I walk across the stage, it might click, 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 and that could connotate gender. They said, no, everybody removes their shoes. The artist will come behind the curtain, sit down, and play. Those of us that are evaluating the artist will listen. We won't see anything at all. We'll just use our ears, and we will score. And then that's how we will decide who moves on and who gets the seats. Almost instantly, the composition of the gender balance in the symphony orchestra began to change. With that incremental, not like small systems change, it wasn't even really a radical change. It basically changed the face of who was getting those seats. And if you fast forward to today, most symphony orchestras hover around about 40% female in the seats. Some are even closer to 50%. So it was never about the women's ability to do the job. It was about the bias that was introduced into that system by us as humans about who had historically been there, who we believe should be there. And that clouded our ability to make objective judgments about who was getting the seats when we were just focused on what we believed to be true and what always had been. And so that system change basically helped to support a different outcome. Here's the other cool thing that happened. Not only did that system change impact gender, it also impacted more people of color getting seats, more people from the LGBTQIA+ community getting seats, more people from the diverse ability and disability community getting seats. It impacted accessibility for many different dimensions of diversity. So that's an important piece to note too, that when you solve for equity, it lifts everyone and it benefits everyone. So that's just one example, and I'll challenge you to say, so at hospice, what is your audition process? What is something that might be happening in your organization that you want to say, hey, we maybe need to think about solving for to make it more accessible or serving more people or expanding our reach? What's preventing us from doing that? And could it be a system change that we need to make to drive a different outcome than we're receiving today? So here's the next thing I want to talk about is this point in time, the urgency of now. I have been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space for about the last 20 years, and I've never seen the amount of urgency around this challenge and this issue that I have in recent times. And I think all of us have recognized, especially with events over the past year or so, that our communities, our families, our staff members are going to hold us accountable to equity more than ever before. They're going to hold us accountable to inclusion. They're going to hold us accountable to diversity. And it's not just enough to say that we want to do it. Our constituents are looking for our actions to match up with what we say. So it's important to think about why do we need to prioritize equity? What do we risk by not prioritizing equity in our organization? And that's the next discussion question that I want you to think about is, in your organization, in your community, if you do not fully lean in to equity, inclusion, diversity, these principles, what does your organization risk by not doing it? So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and take a few minutes with your colleagues to have this conversation. And I'll see you back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some great conversation. I'm guessing that you talked about things like relevancy. I'm guessing that you talked about things like retaining talent in your organization, reflecting the communities that you serve to allow you to expand your reach and serve everyone. There's so many reasons why this conversation is incredibly important. I want to next show you an example of organizations that do fully lean in. What do they do? What do they do differently than organizations maybe who haven't thought about or prioritized equity and inclusion? So here's just a snapshot of what some of the organizations do differently. First is that acknowledgement of the systems piece that we were just talking about, and knowing that those inequities do exist and acknowledging that. Organizations that really lean and commit resources, and that can be people resources, it could be financial resources, or both. Organizations that lean in also take risk. They know that doing the same thing they've always done is not going to get them to different outcomes. So trying some bold and new approaches to see what happens is a really important part of this puzzle. They also understand the privilege and power differentials. So some of those invisible doors that I talked about, they start to begin to understand where those exist in the organization. And they also begin to think about where power is concentrated and how diverse and inclusive are those spaces. They seek and integrate feedback from across the organization and from their constituents to make decisions. And then they ensure transparency in decision making. So they share the outcomes and rationale behind the decisions that they've used feedback from their constituents to incorporate that decision making process. They work for diversity within their staff and board to be reflective of the communities that they're looking to serve. They embrace the systems change part of it. You know, we can talk about the human side and how we interact, but that systems change piece is equally important, and we're not going to be successful unless we do both. Organizations also, once they understand the privilege and power differentials, they share power, and they do things to flatten the power structure in their organizations. They also work hard to engage diverse communities, and this idea of doing things with communities, not doing things to communities. And you all serve a broad range of community constituents, so that's an important one for your organization specifically. They take responsibility and ownership for equity, knowing that it is everyone's role in the organization, but specifically the people at the top of the organization that have to own and take responsibility and be active in infusing equity, inclusion, and diversity into the organization. And then finally, if they're leaning in, they also support other organizations that do the same. So I'm curious, how do you think your organization is doing? Which of these things are you doing really well right now? Which of these things would be areas for opportunity for your organization? I'm going to ask you to pause and have this conversation with your colleagues in the room. Just have a little talk about that. Where do we have opportunity to be better? Where are some things here on this list that we're doing really well? And have some conversation. I'll see you back in just a minute. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had some good discussion about your current starting point and where your organization is. And it's important to note that we can't focus on everything, but making decisions about where we can push ourselves a little differently and make some changes and do some risk taking or some leaning in is a really important place to begin. So our last section today is talking about you as leaders in the organization and what you can do to be more of an equity leader and have inclusion front of mind as you interact with your colleagues and your constituents. So I'm going to leave you today with 3 things that I think everyone who is watching can do to support becoming a stronger equity leader. The first is knowing yourself and understanding your biases. The second is getting proximity and having authentic relationships with those who identify differently than you. And the third is having a role in accountability to equity, accountability to yourself, but also accountability within your organization. So let's unpack each of these just a little bit. One really great way to begin to understand where some of those implicit biases may be showing up for you is to go on a site called Project Implicit. And this site was designed many years ago. It's been running now all over the world for many years. Some really smart scientists put together a tool that helps to measure how our brain is making the associations between different things, which might give us an indication of where some of those implicit biases might be happening for us in our thought process without us even knowing. So what this does not measure is, it doesn't mean that if you have some implicit associations based on any of these dimensions that you're acting in a way that is prejudiced or racist or sexist or any of those ists. What it does is help you understand where unconsciously your brain might be making some of those associations that you're not even aware of, which though do impact your decision making, all in an unconscious manner. So I'm going to say to all of you, you just look up Project Implicit and it will come up. I would suggest that taking time to do a few of these is really important because it begins to bring forward where some of those invisible door frames might be. I personally remember when I first took the gender and career one, and I'm somebody who I say, oh, I'm girl power, girls can do anything. And I came back with my result having a very strong preference for men in the workplace. And I didn't believe it. I was like, no way, that can't be true. And I took the test again and I got the same result that I got the first time. But as I then reflected on my relationship with my husband, what I expect from him, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, there is something to that. And then I had a panic moment saying, wow, have I, over time been making decisions that negatively impact women in the workplace when I'm hiring or promoting or giving salaries? The question potentially is a real good, valid question. That's possible, that it could have been impacting my decision making. But now that I know that this is something that implicitly might be going on for me, I have the ability now to slow down my decision making, check myself, make sure I bring people around me as I'm making decisions about hiring and other things, so that this potential bias piece won't be getting in the way in my decision making going forward, because now I know about it and I can really be conscious of and talk through my decision making to make sure that I'm not letting that creep in. So I'm going to ask all of you at some point, go to Project Implicit and take a few of these and see what happens. And your results are just for you. This isn't to share with the world. This is really just information for you to begin to say, where am I and what do I need to know about my implicit bias, and have that become conscious so that you can make better decisions and interrupt that bias going forward. Unless we know where it is, we have no idea how to stop or interrupt it. So it's an important part of the puzzle to get this information. The other thing that's important is this idea of understanding how to get active in this space and how to continue to push yourself and move forward on the journey to becoming an equity leader. Sometimes people ask me, well, where do I start, Emily? How do I do this? How do I move myself forward? And it's important to kind of understand where you are in the journey and where you are in this process. And so are you at that place still where you're avoiding some of those hard questions? You potentially usually just surround yourself with people who you're familiar with, who share dimensions of diversity with you. You're not sure that the isms are a thing. You like being comfortable. If you're there, you want to push yourself to get into that next realm where we're talking about, yeah, I recognize that some of these things might be inequitable. I'm going to get into that space of being uncomfortable a little bit and test out and ask questions that might make me feel uncomfortable. I'm going to get in that space where I educate myself and learn more about DEI and how that impacts me and the world around me and the people that I'm serving. I'm going to start to be honest about where bias might be showing up for me, where knowledge gaps might exist. And I'm really going to start to surround myself with people who look and think and have experiences that are different from mine. And then as you push even further, it's really getting into that active space. Now it's identifying opportunities where I might have access to things and others may not, and then beginning to say, how can I change things and promote and advocate for policies that drive equity and inclusion? I'm going to be uncomfortable and I'm going to be okay with that. I'm going to speak out when I see things that aren't equitable. I'm going to work to influence other people to understand how the inequities that are happening might impact our ability to fulfill our mission or to serve everyone. This next one is a big one. Not letting mistakes deter me from getting better. It is not going to be perfect. It's important to be authentic and not let that fear of saying or doing the wrong thing prevent you from being in action. It's better to be in action than it is to be perfect. And that's an important thing as you push yourself through this journey. When you have power, do you yield power to those who maybe don't always get a voice or a seat at the table? And then finally, it's that idea of really being intentional about surrounding yourself with people who think and look differently than you do, and doing that on a regular basis all the time. So that second one is about that last one, this idea of setting up authentic relationships. And we build those relationships with people, we get in proximity with people who are different than we are. And so I actually want you to do an activity to start that process today with some of your colleagues that are in the room. And I want you to answer this question. Where do you come from that is not a place? And I want you to give each person in the room just a minute or so to reflect and think about that question and answer that question. Where do you come from that is not a place? And I want you to try to think about how that piece of where you come from has shaped who you've became today as a leader in the organization. So I want you to take enough time on this for everybody to have a minute or two just to be able to share and for you to be able to take in what you are doing with each other as it relates to this piece. So go ahead and pause the video And I will be back with you in just a moment once you're done giving everyone a chance to contribute. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that that was great to get into proximity with your colleagues and talk about some things that maybe you haven't talked with them about before. Hopefully you learned something new and made some connections about what people bring to the table, where they've been, and how that shapes their leadership in the space and place today. Here's another thing that I would want you to do to get some proximity. And oftentimes when we do have our biases show up and we do have potential places where we're uncertain or have fears about different dimensions of diversity, it's because oftentimes we just don't have exposure to them or don't have the knowledge we need to understand those perspectives. And so I'm bringing the wheel back this time, and I'm going to encourage each of you to think about, what dimensions do you feel least comfortable with as we think about the dimensions in this wheel? And I want you to get really specific with that. Is it a certain religion? Is it a certain gender dynamic? Is it a certain sexual orientation? Is it a certain political belief, right? I want you to get really granular and say, how can I begin to expand my learning and perspective based on that thing or that dimension? And this idea that you need to be intentional and begin to do some research to better understand so that you can know and just not bank on what you've always thought you knew about something, but to learn and grow and expand your perspective. But then also be intentional about surrounding yourself and getting proximity with people who experience that dimension firsthand so that you can begin to learn and understand more about what that's like. And my example here is my husband and I both grew up Catholic. We both have strong Catholic families. And throughout my upbringing, I never knew anyone who practiced the Jewish faith tradition. We just didn't have anyone in our community. We never talked about other religions that much outside of my home, so I just didn't have knowledge about it. And as I grew up, I said, you know what, I want to change that. I want to understand more about that, and started to do my research to understand that religion. And even when I made a move, my husband and I moved to the city of Baltimore. We made an intentional decision to move into a Jewish community so we could have Jewish neighbors and learn more and understand and get that proximity based on just putting ourselves in a space and place where people experience that dimension, which was religion, differently than we do. So that's what I'm talking about. And remembering that once you start to build those relationships, it's not the other person's responsibility to educate you, but it's your responsibility to learn and listen and see how they're experiencing life as you build that authentic relationship with them. So I'm going to challenge each of you to do that for one or two things that make you uncomfortable as it relates to the dimensions of diversity. And that's where we need to push ourselves and be intentional and get out of the space of us feeling comfortable all the time into some of the unknown and uncomfortable, which helps us to push through moving the bias. The last thing I want to talk about today is accountability. And everyone, no matter what your seat in the organization, whatever your role is, all of you have a role to play around accountability. And it can be personal accountability as your leadership and how you're interacting with others, but it can also be when we see and experience things in our organization that might not be equitable. What do we do and how do we handle those pieces? And how can we create an environment where we can have good conversation and good questioning and push ourselves to do better? And the reason why this is important, again, is remember, we're all humans, and we as humans introduce bias into organizations. Organizational inequities result from an accumulation of small decisions that we as people make on a personal level. That's how it happens, right? So we have to consistently hold our organization and the people within it accountable to equity. The biggest piece is if you see something that you believe is not working for everyone or maybe inequitable or may have some bias creeping into it, it's important to say something about it and to talk about it and to have the conversation versus just, allowing it to continue in the environment. You see something, you say something, and then if you have the power to do so and the influence to do so, I'm going to ask you to say, then it's your turn to change it, right? If you are in charge of something and you can modify or reimagine a system to make it work better for someone, or take on a process and do it a little differently, or make a decision and bring more people into the conversation, I want you to do all of those things. I want you to get active in making equity an important part of how you make decisions and how you view problems and solutions in your organization. So it's not just enough for us to sit here and learn and understand this. It's really about applying an equity lens and keeping our eyes open to when it's an important conversation to push. And I'm not saying, you know, stomp your feet and flip a table every time something doesn't go right. It's about asking key questions like, I know we've always done it that way, but why? Is there a reason why we can't try this time? Or who else needs to be a part of this conversation to make sure that we're really reflecting the voice of our community that we're trying to serve? Are there others that should be here giving us input to this conversation? It's those types of things that we want you to be thinking about as you're moving through your organization to drive equity as you go forward. So I hope you all enjoyed the time with us spending, just taking a little deep dive into this today. I thank you for having the conversations with each other, if you're with colleagues or if you did this on your own, just to self-reflect on some of the things that we talked about. This is the last thing I'm going to ask you to do as we leave here is, you know, that's great that we spent this hour together, but really the work begins as you leave and go into the leadership and from this point forward. So I want you to, as we close, think about what is something specific that you would do differently tomorrow based on the concepts we discussed today. And then secondly, how are you going to hold yourself and others accountable to equity? So I'm going to leave you all with these two questions to consider. Please take time with your colleagues or on your own to reflect and make decisions about how you're going to ensure equity in your organization. It's critical to the success and the relevancy. And most importantly, it's not about us, but it's about the people we are serving and how equity and inclusion and diversity allows us to be the best organization we can be for our constituents and for our community. So thank you so much for your time today. I enjoyed being here with all of you. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have additional questions about anything we covered today. Have some great conversations with each other as we close, and have a wonderful day. Thank you all.